your patience with various internet speeds that we have. And just some quick meeting norms. We're all here to share and we're all here to learn. So we ask everyone, be patient, make space for other people to ask questions and share, be open-minded. If you're, asking a question or commenting, try to stay on topic and keep things concise. And then again, to minimize distractions, keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. All right, George and Julie, you ready for me to turn it over to you?
Yeah, and we won't go into this particular sort of talking through this lease example right away, but we will in just a few minutes. So thanks everyone who's back, and thank you to anybody who's new, and also a thank you to people who did reach out and ask questions, or a few people were able to fit in trying to do the exercise even in a very busy time. So it was really helpful to hear from people who did reach out to us, because it helped us think about what to focus on in this second session. This is one of those topics that you could spend a week sitting around the kitchen table and still not really clear it all up and answer all of the questions. So we'll do the best we can this evening to cover topics and questions that were raised by people who got in touch with us. And I'll go over those in just a minute, but before I do that, I also wanted to just introduce Paul Neubauer, who's also joining us this evening to help present. Paul was an apprentice with George and I back in 2015 and 2016, and in his second year, he actually ran a custom grazing enterprise that our ranch took on, and from there, he has continued to explore that as one part of his career path. After he left us, he worked for someone we know, helping them with their cattle, and then from there moved on to Velikas Farms, which is one of the mentor sites in the NAP program. And he is foreman at Velikas Farms, and this year was actually doing another custom grazing enterprise up there. So he's someone who can speak really deeply to sort of the process of moving from a novice to an apprentice to actually starting to figure out how to have your own enterprise, and what some of the things he's learned in the course of that. So we'll try to sort of move through this sample lease and some questions around that in the first half hour or so, and then turn it over to Paul, and that way we'll have a lot of time in the second hour to be able to ask questions and go into any topic further based on people's interests and curiosities. So what we decided to do when we started getting questions from people was to actually create a sample lease sort of situation that's a real life scenario with a piece of property that George and I own, but would be a piece that we would potentially let an apprentice or some other young agrarian lease from us, and then contract graze other people's cattle on it. And so we put together an example just to sort of hopefully answer questions or confusions that might have arisen when you were trying to do this yourself. And we also tried to take into account the questions that people had asked us. One question that several people had was, they discovered that leasing land in their area was actually done by the acre rather than by the animal unit. And so the sample we put together is by acre, but then we translate that into animal days, because that's an essential part of figuring out how many animals you can run and meet your land goals. There were some questions about if you have to have infrastructure or equipment and it's a sizable expense, how do you factor that in? Is that something you're responsible for? Is that something the landowner or the cattle operator would, or can you borrow it or lease it from someone else short term? So I think that's something that Paul will actually speak to. In addition, there were some questions about how do you actually access land? And how do you make yourself competitive? If there are a lot of people trying to get a grazing lease in your area, how do you make yourself stand out? And then the last question that one person had was, if you're not raising lactating cattle, do you actually need to make sure that you have 3% of body weight in your forage? And that's something we can talk about as well. And unfortunately, our screen just did this weird thing that it does, and I can't read. What did you do something, George?
No, I didn't do anything.
I don't know why it does this.
I don't either. It's got a split screen. there
We
for
have a
some
split screen and we don't know how to get off. View options here, fit to window, original size. No, that
No.
didn't do it.
reason.
Sorry, everyone. Your options.
You
what's
sure it
the-
wasn't you, George?
What's that?
I said, are you sure it wasn't you?
Well, it could be, but it wasn't.
He
on
didn't.
purpose.
He
I
didn't touch.
move.
Neither of us touched it, so I don't know
Oh.
what happened. Fit to window
Oh.
doesn't work.
Do you want me to stop sharing the PowerPoint? Will that make it easier to see?
Well, I need to be able to read it. I don't know what happened.
While you're doing that, one of the things
George can talk while I try
Yeah.
to figure out our screen.
I want people to kind of get out of this is I don't want to just reduce this to a math problem necessarily, where all you're really worried about is whether it's 3% of body weight and animal days, and all that stuff is very important, and we definitely want to teach people how to use those resources. But I am what you're really going to do is you're leasing the story, and you have to think about, if you're going to walk out on a piece of land and you're going to listen to somebody who might be leasing it to you, you need to listen to the story that the person tells you about this land. And the fact that you ask them how many animals they ran on it, they may not really know. And unless they're really savvy managers, they probably don't really know how many animals they ran on a piece of ground for how long, but they have a general idea. And they might say, oh, we ran 100 pairs on there for, I don't know, about 3 months. And, so that's a piece of information that you need to then put in the back of your mind. And then you take the area calculations for what the normal stocking rates are for a particular area and type of land, and then see if that makes sense, if what the old rancher told you makes sense with what those numbers are, and try and find yourself in a place where you really feel like you're going to understand the story. And then look at the piece of land. If it's grazed down into the dirt, then it's going to take a long time for it to recover, and it might be quite a while before you can actually start to run animals on it. And if it was overstocked, his story may be you need to cut back on that, at least initially. And so those are the kind of things that I want you to kind of approach this from that mindset, as well as being able to take the numbers that we give you and turn them into a way to make a rational and an informed decision. So go ahead there now if you've got that back.
And I think what George said about the story is really important. And so one of the things we did here in this example was we tried to put in a few facts and a little bit about what the landowner's goals or the landowner's story was. So as I said before, this is an example where the land is being offered to you on a per acre basis rather than an animal unit basis. And one of the reasons to be cautious about getting into a lease that's on an acre basis is that unless you've really walked that landscape and you know it well, like George said, you may be paying for acres that actually don't have any grazable forage on them. There may be a lot of bare ground. There may be weeds that are unpalatable or even toxic. So we always try to convince a landowner to translate it into animal unit months, and we'll work with them to do that, but they may not do that. And so this example is by acre. So I won't read all of this, but I'll just kind of mention a few big things. So it's 130 acres of sub-irrigated native pasture, and it's in good shape. It has good infrastructure. It has one water point in the middle of a wagon wheel set up with the different pastures. It's 7 miles from where, from headquarters. So it would be a 7-mile drive one way to get to it from your normal workplace. Average per acre pasture lease in our area for that kind of pasture is currently $10 to $13 an acre. And I listed a few of the places we referenced in order to make sure we were coming up with a lease rate that was reasonable. And then we put in a little information about the landowner, that the landowner actually kept fairly good records, and they had 83 animal units for 105 days during the growing season. And their goal is they want to leave good residue to foster regrowth. So they don't want you to graze it into the ground. They want you to be pretty conscientious with your management. And so, and what they've done in the past is done a lot of subdividing with temporary fence in order to get good utilization and make sure they don't overgraze. So that's kind of the story. That's the background. So carrying capacity, I actually put that in blue, and you can see where we calculated the carrying capacity based on the information that the landowner gave us. If the landowner didn't overgraze it, that's what you've got. You've actually got 8,715 animal units. You divide that by the number of acres, and that tells you your animal days per acre. And carrying capacity is something you can't negotiate. You might be able to convince the landowner to charge you less because you're going to do really excellent management and fix a lot of infrastructure. Or you may be able to convince the livestock owner to pay you more because you're going to really do a wonderful job keeping track of herd health. But the land can only provide what the land provides. And that's one of the reasons why I think we really want to just hammer home that if it's not a parcel you're familiar with, you really need to gauge that and gauge that well. So then we just have the calculations like you had in your worksheet, 1.5 hours of labor, 3 times a week, 16-mile round trip. It takes 40 minutes to drive it because a lot of it is not on, it's actually driving through a pasture to get to this particular part of the meadow. So altogether you need to make $1,722.40 in order to cover your costs. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And I don't see any questions showing up in the chat, so I'm going to assume that that's pretty clear, and we'll just move to the next slide where we kind of like start to pull the pieces together. There we go. So how many animals do you need in order to cover your costs? So right here, again, we got ground truth this $20 a month per head is a pretty reasonable cost, a payment that you would get for summer grazing. Winter grazing would be higher because it's more labor intensive and a lot of other things. So $20 a month. An animal unit is a 1,000-pound cow. So we just do some calculations there around, you could, about how to figure out how many animals you need to run. And that I know might be a little confusing there about how you move from a 1,000-pound cow to an 800-pound yearling, which is 0.8 animal units, because it's, so you have 0.2 left, it's 2/10 left, you take your 86 animal units times 0.2, you get 17.2 animal units. So you can run 103 head of yearlings.
With an average weight of 800 pounds
Right.
for the season.
And so then if we just down there, we have that if you're running cows, you'd have 86 animal units for 101 days. If you're running yearlings, you have lower animal units, you can run more animals, and you have a few extra days. So that's part of what you try to figure out is what, like George said, what's the story that the land is telling you? Is that land a really good place for lactating mothers? Is it a good place to do breed up? Is it a good place just to be putting pounds of gain on yearlings? And that's going to be part of what you want to figure out is what kind of forage do you have access to, and what's going to be the animal that's going to do best on that and is also going to cover your costs. So you can run that many animals for that many days and cover your costs, but you're not going to make a profit. You're going to pay yourself that minimum wage, but you don't have any profit. This is where running yearlings can actually be a really good choice, because if you run yearlings, you can run them on the gain. If you have pretty decent pasture, you can assume you might be able to get at least 2 pounds a day gain of weight on each animal. And the calculations then are there about how you would figure out how much you would make on the gain. So if you were really good with your pasture management, made sure those cattle were never hungry, you know, watched their health condition, made sure that you were subdividing in a good way, you could potentially make an additional $7,000 on gain. So that's the place where sometimes you can find a sweet spot with custom grazing. So this is just one scenario. This isn't the only scenario, but we wanted to just show you one situation where you actually can put all of the pieces together and have something that not only covers your cost and gives you a good experience, helps you fulfill your landowner's goals, but the livestock owner is going to be thrilled if you can get that 2 pounds of gain. And then when we were running through trying to come up with the scenario that worked, Sam and Noel and George and I, we tried a bunch of different scenarios, and we actually all learned a few things. And so those are there at the bottom of this slide. It just says, if you have to drive a long distance every time you need to go move fence, that can really cut into any kind of profit, and you may even lose money. So you really want to be conscientious about how far do you have to drive, and is it going to pay? Then just paying by the acre means that you might be paying for land that actually isn't productive, and you're basically paying for nothing. Rather than buying equipment, can you lease it? Can you borrow it? Can you, will your employer let you day lease it from them when you need it? So trying to find ways to not have to make a lot of major expenses when you're first starting out. Make sure you know your carrying capacity, and just really be fine-tuning your grazing skills all of the time so that you can find that balance between taking care of the animals and taking care of the land. So I know that was kind of a fire hose overview of this. And like George said, we don't necessarily want to drill down into the math too much if that's not useful for people. So if people have any sort of questions or specifically around how you figure out something like this, this might be a good time to at least take some of those questions. And I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, George.
Well, you're just building your reputation here, and you're building your skills. And it's very important that if you have to drive a long distance, it's really hard to pay attention to the details. And if you're running cattle, especially for gain, paying attention to details is what it's all about. And making sure that you're not, that you're just taking the very tops of the forage and you're giving those animals the absolute best feed you can give them every day, and that's an attention to a detail that it's imperative if you're really going to make it work. If you have to drive a long ways, that just makes it harder to pay attention to those kind of details. But you can do pretty well if you come around every other day or even every third day. But if it's more than that, then it's really hard because things change very quickly. And so I just would caution against a long drive, I guess, and not being able to focus on the detail.
So I see that there's a couple of questions. So one of them is, if we usually work with landowners who have pretty similar views as we do about land management and carrying capacity, I think that that's actually where George and I have gotten most of our leased land, is that it's been landowners who had conservation easements or were certified organic, or for some reason they they didn't want somebody to just come and put 300 head and set stock them and come back 3 months later. They were people who did care, often for ecological reasons, about the quality of the land that was in their care. And that's specifically why they ended up working with us. So I think if you develop a reputation for being the kind of grazer who does a really good job with anything in particular like that, it will help you find people that you don't have conflict with. The only time we've ever had anything that was even remotely like a conflict was just the fact that because we always leave a lot of residue. And so on some of the property we've leased, for 7 or 8 years, sort of the neighbors would see that there was all of this feed left, and they would be sort of frustrated that the landowner wasn't going to let them bring their cattle on and eat that feed, but it was left for a reason. It was left so that the land would recover and it would be good for next year's grazing season. So I think Paul will speak to this. It's like, ultimately it comes down to developing connections and relationships and a reputation. And that's a lot of what helps you get access to people who want the skills that you have. We also are certified organic and Audubon certified. So the landowner who had those kinds of concerns would be seeking out someone like us. And as far as word of mouth, our range ecologist here, our Nrcs range ecologist, is somebody that we go out and do range readiness with every year. And as a result, she's become a really good friend. And she's somebody like that in your community is going to be the person who always knows all of the land that somebody has, that they need somebody to graze. So we get more opportunity to graze parcels of land than we can possibly manage, simply because of knowing one person who works in an agency and works with landowners all over our area. So again, reputation, relationship, that's been, so, if the Nrcs or Society of Range Management, any sort of organization is hosting workshops or get-togethers, farmers union meetings, anything like that is going to help you meet people who have similar concerns and similar values, and that's going to open doors for you. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, George.
Not a whole lot. That kind of covers it. Yeah, it's what like I mentioned at the last session, it's building a reputation and taking care of details, paying your bills on time, and showing up and doing the work, and that people respect that, and it goes a long ways, because you're especially if you're going to lease land by the acre, you want to lease it for the whole year, so you have control of that residue that you're leaving behind. Don't lease land by the acre for 4 months. Lease it. You want to have a year-round lease with a deal like that, and hopefully a 3 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10-year lease. That's really great then, because then you've got something that you're in charge of, and that's the kind of thing I would recommend everybody work towards, is that sort of a more long-term relationship if you can. So that's all I have. Let's look.
Yeah. So I don't know, are there any other questions that anybody has kind of about this? If not, we'll kind of turn it over to Paul, and then we'll have a whole lot of time for questions a little later. Okay, I don't see anything happening. So, and now for Paul.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I see some nodding. That's good. I had a couple things to add to some topics that George and Julie were just covering. One being, I have some particular feelings about that lease by the acre format. I would say that leasing for $1 per acre, especially with grazing, is an example of a landowner trying to isolate risk away from themselves, right? A lot of agricultural management in farming and ranching is about managing risk, and drought and production is, obviously one of those risks that every year we all take on. And a landowner who charges by the acre is isolating themselves from the productive capacity of their place and putting all of that risk onto you. So I would be very hesitant to lease grass on a per acre basis, even if it's pretty cheap, unless you have some other factor about that land that you really want. For instance, I have a lease that's a dollar number per acre, but it has a water source on it that I use or can use, which is connected to some other land I have access to already that we farm. So that's one item I wanted to mention, because mitigating risk and trying to find ways to share risk, I think, are really important. The other thing, specific for people in Montana, we have a Montana Farmlink, which is a website hosted by the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition. And so that's a place where they have land opportunities, work opportunities, and some other more creative sort of agricultural business relationship opportunities. And you can create a profile on that in Montana and post a very detailed explanation of what it is you want to do. I actually just recently was looking over it because we have at the farm some internship listings on Montana Farmlink. And I was just reviewing that. And then I noticed there's somebody nearby in Malta, and he's a person, it looks like, who has a very similar trajectory to me and has a business plan that's like almost identical to mine and lives within 2 hours. And I was like, I should know this person. Perhaps we can work together. So I don't know how much traffic that really gets at this point in time, but marketing is a thing that you need to do constantly and in great volume to have success. So that's another opportunity for that. I guess before I ramble anymore, I should make some introduction about myself. Julie mentioned my role as an apprentice at San Juan Ranch, and the fact that I work as the foreman at Velicus Farms. So that position at Velicus Farms is pretty important to the enterprise that I have, small custom grazing enterprise that I've developed over the past year. Velicus Farms is a large-scale organic dryland crop farm. So we farm about, about 9,000 acres in northern Montana. And all of that is dry land, and we grow a large variety of stuff and do a very complex cover crop rotation. And I came to work at Velicus, one, to learn about the cropping rotation. I have an interest in organic farming and not just ranching, but also because there was opportunity for me here, specific to my vision around grazing and starting an enterprise. So I point that out in particular because my path towards creating a custom grazing enterprise, which is how I'm involved with leasing, involved me seeking out a place for opportunity and going there, as opposed to looking around where I was for the opportunity that fit me. So that may be something to consider. For instance, Northern Hill County, very close to the border, is a place with a lot of opportunity for people like myself without much, shall we say, capital behind us or experience or assets, because the land here is, the price of it is actually linked to its agricultural production value, which is an increasingly rare thing throughout the West and in Montana in particular. So there's an opportunity where land is cheap to have land access that does not exist in the same proportion where land is expensive. So some brief overview of what I have going for a grazing business. I just finished grazing a small herd of pears for the summer. I was paid $40 per pair. So we did not negotiate on an animal unit basis, but simply on a pair basis, cow and calf. And I did that from approximately June 1st until yesterday when the cattle left the farm. I grazed those animals almost exclusively on cover crop on one small section of our farm. And that was cover crop that we plant in the green manure phase of our crop rotation. So its primary purpose for our agronomy is to put nitrogen into the soil. Our current management practice for most of that cover crop is to till it under. So there's an opportunity there for me to extract some value through grazing from a cover crop, which we normally spend money to terminate in the form of diesel and equipment time. And also give some more value back to the farm and help with the soil building effect. The pairs, oh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. 1 second, please. Just gonna pull up my notes. I decided to do that type of deal with custom grazing instead of buying a bunch of animals, because I have some basic goals. The first goal being that I want to graze cattle on our farm ground. That's interesting to me. It gives me passion. It also fits my land ethic. And I think it's essential to a healthy farming system. That goal's really simple, right? I just want to graze cows on the farm. So that gives me a lot of flexibility to do any old thing. I could get a bunch of yearlings if that were available, or go out and borrow some money and buy a whole ton of cows, or do this custom grazing thing. I just want to start with that's my goal, and then look at how can I make that happen. The custom grazing is really appealing to me because I'm trying to separate myself from risk. I don't have a lot of assets. I don't have a lot of ability to endure risk. From a financial standpoint, I have a pretty low cash income from my job. I can't really afford to buy things on cash, and I don't have the income to support a conventional financing model and pay interest on conventional financing. So custom grazing is a way that I can achieve my goal, grazing the cows on the farm ground, without having to dive headfirst into a lot of risk, financial, and all of the emotional and physical consequences that come from enduring that kind of risk. And also, one of my main motivations for this business is I don't want to make or feed hay, because I think making or feeding hay is like the agricultural equivalent of owning a boat. It's just a huge money pit. So if I can avoid ever making hay or buying hay, that will be really great. And also, I think from an ecological standpoint, it's probably better for the planet. So that's a basic outline of the business I want to run. And I guess from this point, I could go through a whole list and litany of my experience, or tell you a novel length narrative of it, or we could engage with some specific questions about my background, which honestly would be really helpful, because that would help me to stop talking.
Paul, I thought one thing that might be useful is for you to just give people a general, like, from when you started kind of engaging in agriculture, which I guess was at Warren Wilson, to now, like, how many years has it been of you being pretty committed to this, between kind of being more or less a novice to getting to the point where you are now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did the math, basically a decade now. So I kind of started working in agriculture like right after I graduated high school, not in a dedicated fashion, but that was my first exposure to working with cattle.
And just as a heads up to people, most of the young people we know that now have their own business, are managing a large enterprise, have really moved into that level. For the most part, it's about a decade from when they really start to the point where they're really, so that's, I don't say that as to sort of squash anybody, but just recognizing how long it takes to become really good at all of this stuff. And it's an incredibly complicated amount of stuff to learn. And so that's not to dissuade you, it's to just kind of light a fire under your belly and be really realistic about the fact that after a year or two, you may not quite be ready to leap into a huge enterprise.
Well, I think it would be really generous to say that I'm very good at this stuff, but I at least am set up to try things. One point I wanted to make about experience, which your question just brought up, is we were just going through that list of like all of the math for doing your calculations about like what your carrying capacity is, all of that stuff. And then you guys were explaining like the details of like, how do you make decisions about when to feed and, you know, how frequently to move, and if you're going to do yearlings or all of that stuff, that I would be very uncomfortable learning how to make those decisions inside of my own business. I personally am a risk averse person, so I sought the education and the knowledge and the responsibility of making decisions like that inside of a more sheltered experience that was my apprenticeship, right? And so particularly to me, George and Julie, you know, gave me an opportunity to practice that management, to act like an owner, and to learn all of those skills. I didn't engage with those skills through a trial and error process that involved personal financial risk to me. So thanks, George and Julie, for enduring the personal financial risk to my benefit. I see some questions, so I think I can go to those if that's okay. Let me see if I can find my way to them.
Do you want me to read them out loud to you, Paul? Would that help? Or
that would be very helpful.
Let me do that. I will be question person. So
okay.
One question is, do you have a very formal contract with Velicus around the grazing business?
Yes, I guess, well, I would say no, because you use the word very formal, which might be a little extreme, but I have a formal agreement. It's not a contract per se, and I could go into why contract is actually a nonsense word in what we do, because we don't have contracts. But anyways, I have a memorandum of understanding. So that outlines basically I have assets that I have invested in that I am bringing to the operation. Doug and Anna, my mentors and the owners of the farm, have assets that might be valuable to the ranching operation. So we identified those. So those, for example, would include, I have a pickup. I have actually 2 pickups, both of which are for the ranch. I have a stock trailer. I have a water truck, different assets that I've invested in. As part of my agreement with Doug and Anna, right, they're then going to allow me access to other things I need. So I use the swather to make swaths for swath grazing. They have one of those. So we identified that. A loader tractor I've used several times, another smaller tractor for setting posts, etc. So just, we thought about all the things that we might need to use and just put them out there. And then our agreement also outlines that I will use that equipment, but also some of my things in exchange are available to the farm where that's necessary. So we're finding ways to have equality for what they're offering me in terms of access to land and what I'm offering them in terms of some grazing income and the value of the cattle being on their farmland. And then we also have some specific structure in there about revisiting our memorandum of understanding. on a yearly basis, to change it as the business grows and adapts, and also to make sure we don't have any hard feelings about things that are in that. And it outlines some very basic stuff, like what is the value of the forage, and who makes decisions about the cattle, and how I, being the person who makes decisions about the cattle, come to those decisions, how I should, or how we should expect me to engage with Doug and Anna as the people ultimately responsible for the land, how I should engage with them about making decisions. So those are some of the basics inside of that memorandum.
That's just a good point about, you have to sort of put a dollar value on things. So even if you're not exchanging money, you know the value of what you are exchanging in an agreement like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna say?
That, I was just going to say, it goes back to the value of open and honest communication, and you know, that makes everything a lot smoother. If when things get hard, that if you've had a conversation with your landowner or your livestock owner beforehand, and you know, they just know that you're open and honest, and nobody's trying to hide anything, and you're working on the land the way it is. The other thing I would say about investing in things for this project is that you want to invest in things that make you versatile. Things like portable corrals, a chute that's on wheels, electric fencing that's solar powered, so it doesn't need to be plugged in. Everything needs to be portable and movable. And a water truck is a really valuable thing in certain parts of the country. Sometimes we don't really use a water truck to haul water, but we use it as a portable storage. And then we have a low flow of some sort that runs in the water truck. And then we have a tank that we attach to the water truck and use it like a reservoir. But we don't really use it to haul water around. Other places you could, you know, if you have to haul water, you need to do that. But those are the kind of things, when you think about an investment, something that makes it versatile, makes your job easier, and takes you in the direction you really want to go with your grazing operation. Not something that's a one-off that you're going to have to buy for this particular place and then can't use again.
So I'll go to the next question, which was piggybacking off the earlier question about Velicus. What was the progression of your engagement with Velicus? Did you see the opportunity? Did they offer it to you? What sort of conversations did you have, and what was the timeline? Did you direct those, or were they very much pushing for your involvement forward?
That's a really good and involved question. So I went to visit Doug and Anna primarily because I thought their farm was really cool and I wanted to work there, and I didn't know what I wanted when I went to go visit them. It quickly became apparent that they could use somebody in a middle management role. So I went there thinking partially like, how can I bring grazing and cows, which to that point was my experience, to this farm? And then I got there and I realized that I had so much more to learn about how to do the farming before I could answer that question properly. And also in the immediate, there was an employment opportunity for me that engaged my passions around people management and education, which I do a lot of on the farm. And it was an opportunity to fill a need for Doug and Anna, who could really use that person. So this, I guess, is another instance of doing what's necessary to pursue opportunity, or you know, that's sort of an opportunity long game. Like if I were really determined to just be grazing cows, probably getting a job as foreman at the Velicus Farms would not have been the right choice, because that's way more than a full-time job. So in one way, it didn't necessarily bring me closer to that, because I had to take a detour of a year or more's time doing that work before I was in a position to pursue grazing. Let me just look back at the question again so I can make sure I remember. one thing about Doug and Anna, this is about, did they offer it to you? They're very expressly interested in helping people build a livelihood for themselves in agriculture. So yes, in a way, they very much did offer it to me. They said, you can come work at this farm. There's a ton of ways for you to build something for yourself. Do you want to own your own farm? Do you want to have a business that's a part of this farm? All of that stuff. And those things are still available. So this is also a recruitment for anybody who needs an opportunity. We have lots. Do you want to run a seed cleaning business or make compost? You should talk to me. And the conversations we had were at first a lot about me asking, how does the farm work? Learning how the agronomy works on the farm. That's very important because the organic farming pays for the land here. So my grazing business would not work if I did not have access to the cover crop portion of the crop rotation for grazing, and if the organic crops were not as valuable as they are in paying for the land. So I needed to learn about how the farming happened first. And I would say that as far as the balance of conversation went about building an enterprise and, you know, keeping that progressing, that's definitely a role that Doug and Anna have played for me as mentors, is in encouraging me that I can do more than I think that I can, and being strong examples in work ethic and realizing your vision. I'm also pretty self-motivated in this regard, but having mentors push me to make it happen, you know, and also helping me find opportunity, right? Like a lot of things that I have had opportunity for, I've been helped along by Doug. Like I have a water truck, I got it at auction. Doug actually found this truck at auction for me, you know, knowing what I needed, helping me along. So I hope that answers that question, the several parts of it.
The only thing I wanted to add to that is one of the reasons Paul knew about Velikas Farms was not only because they had become a NAP mentor site, and so there was that sense of networking. You know, it wasn't like he had to find it, you know, some needle in a haystack. There was a connection there that existed that Paul was able to then follow through on. And I actually had met Anna years before she had become a NAP mentor. So there was both a personal friendship as well as the Quivira connection, which supported Paul in looking for what was a good next step. And so not to underestimate the power of networks.
Yeah.
And then the one other question that's here, and then maybe we'll take our break in between the first hour and the second hour, was where do you find cows to custom graze? And I see that Alex put in some information, I think, about some grazing exchange websites, but I don't know if you have anything in particular you want to share about that, Paul.
I don't have a lot of advice that's very useful about that, because thus far my experience has been, again, through personal relationships and networks. Obviously, it's pretty important to put out there into your relationships and networks what it is you would like to do, and try to have a specific plan about what you can offer. You know, I spoke to some people directly offering that I was trying to do some custom grazing, and their questions to me immediately were like, well, how much do you need to charge, and how many can you take, and how long can you take them? And these were all questions I didn't really have good answers to, because this was my first time grazing in this environment, dealing with the water resource constraints that I have and being reliant on rain for the productive capacity of the cover crops. So I don't really have any experience going and seeking out cattle to graze, but on that note, every single person I talk to, I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have said the exact words. People are always looking for grass. Like about every single livestock producer I've ever heard, even if they're not, they're like, yeah, everybody's looking for grass. And I can see that people are looking for grass because damn, their cows really eat most of it wherever they are. So for me, I think in the future, I am going to pursue, again, more personal connections through the organic farming community, through some connections that I have gained in Montana and on the High Line in the past year. And also using some of those resources that were highlighted in the chat. Maybe I'll check those out too and continue to use the Farmlink. For me, I haven't used any formal avenues of advertising or done anything sort of along the conventional line of how you would garner business for a service that you're providing, which is essentially what my business is.
So does anybody else have a question that they want to either type in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask right now? We have or we can just go ahead and take our break now and people can think about whether they have additional questions for Paul or for George or I, or for anybody else actually who's on the screen. So
And maybe one
anybody
other
got
thing,
anything right now?
if there's a particular topic that you just want them to talk a little bit more about too, even if you don't have, like a fully formed question, but there's a particular area of this that you would like to hear them talk a little bit more about.
And we can certainly go back into math if anybody wants to, but I imagine nobody wants to do math at this time of night.
Well, a little bit. I would like to. This doesn't have to happen now, but it would be great to talk about financing.
Yeah, Paul, I'd love for you to, we should definitely talk about that.
So I don't know if in the break anybody wants to think about questions or perhaps bring some of their own experience with seeking financing. I have sought financing through a couple avenues, conventional and non-conventional, and I'd like to share some of my learning from that specific to what a custom grazing enterprise really is in a technical sense. But we can talk about that after the break.
I had a quick question. This could be for all three of you, I guess. Kind of about water and figuring out, with that carrying capacity, it seems like that's just thinking about feed. But if you're also trying to calculate how many animals you can run, especially out here in the West where, there's a lot of wells, and just how do you factor that into the equation? And I guess with a water truck, you can kind of just transport it and figure that out. But yeah, I guess that's my question. How do you factor water into the equation of carrying capacity?
Well, it depends on the class of livestock you're running, but you need to think about on a hot, dry day in the Southwest here, a pair is going to need about 20 gallons of water a day. Up to that, 10 to 15 gallons a day in cooler times like now. And so they need a lot of water, and they also need it available to them in a way that they can all get a drink and not spend all day standing there trying to get a drink from a small flow. You've probably all seen cattle trying to drink out of a garden hose or something that got knocked loose from a tank, or they need to have access to plenty of water and get a drink and then lay down and ruminate. And so that it's critical that you have good clean water and up to, like I say, about 20 gallons a day. I always figure 20 gallons a day per head per animal unit, and that way I know I have enough, and I want to see that much in storage, and I want it to be available to those animals, so that whether I'm running 50 head or I'm running 1,000 head, I want those animals to be able to get a drink and move on to getting back on feed.
For me, water is the entire question, because I have, at this point in time and at the scale that I'm at, an abundance of feed. I have so much feed that I can't finish it. But in this country where I am, people farm where there's not enough water for cows, pretty much. or that's a thing I've heard said before. We farm that because it's too dry for cows, which is kind of a crazy notion. But there's like, you can farm here, cool season spring crops, dry land, and count on precipitation, but there might not be water anywhere. So I had to get a water truck in order to do the grazing I wanted to do. There's maybe 2 places, particular units I grazed this year that had water on them. But most of the time I had to transport water. And so it's not like I have a water truck as security for me. That's the crux of the entire operation. So I need to have security there and make sure that if one of those things fails, I have a backup. So I have a large scale water truck, but I also have several tanks, and the pickups are there so that I can use those pickups in case I have a water emergency. And that truck that transports the water is the largest single investment I made. So I made a significant effort to make sure that like I said, it's absolutely the crux. Everything else after the water is pretty easy. There's tons of feed. I'm grazing farm ground, so I don't really have to worry about residue because the farmer wants all of the crop gone, just the water is everything. And for the rest of the time that I graze animals in this place, that's going to be the case. That'll be my limiting factor always. And that's another reason why I did a custom grazing enterprise instead of buy a bunch of cows, because it's like gets -40 here in the winter, and I'm not set up to keep water liquid at all. So I can't, I'd have to do something significantly different than what I have done, and much more expensive to make myself able to carry animals through the winter. So, the custom grazing enterprise is another way for me to not do that, and hopefully, take a vacation or something.
Thanks everyone for your answers.
Did you want to say something else?
Yeah, when you lease a place, you lease the whole place. And water is one of the first things you want to look at. Whether it's, if you got the Rio Grande River running through there, that's one thing. If you don't have a well or anything else, that's something else. And some places look like there's a lot, and there may be a lot of feed, like Paul's situation there. But if you don't have water, then that's your limiting factor. And so always never forget the water, and that adds cost. And so you calculate those things into your daily hours that you're going to spend and miles you're going to drive. And especially if you're working with a cattle you're trying to get gain on, that all needs to be really working well, because otherwise you won't get the gain that you need if you don't have enough water.
So one thing, if you are currently working someplace where you either have spring-fed water systems or some other way that you can learn from your employer or your mentor how to measure your flow, so that you can figure out how many gallons per minute you get and determine whether you actually have how many animals can water on that water source. And it may also mean, depending on your water, that cattle are the wrong animal. In the Southwest, there are a lot of places where goats or sheep are a much better choice because water is such a limiting factor here. So, we've been talking about cattle because that's what we run currently, but George grew up running sheep. So that's another thing. There might be an animal that's a better choice given what is available to you. So I think maybe we should go ahead and take our break. I know last time we took a 5-minute break. Is that sufficient for people? I think if we need to take a longer one, we can. Looks like Noelle says 5 is fine. 5 good? Okay. All right.
Okay.
Are we back?
I think it's been 5 minutes.
Okay. We just wanted to spend a moment just talking about how we see this final hour. And George and I didn't have a super bunch of stuff pre-planned because we really wanted to be responsive to questions and topics and concerns that you all have, rather than just kind of blurt more information at you. So our thought at this point is that I think the financing question and financing topic is a really important one to talk about. So we thought we'd have Paul launch into that, and then George and I can add to that, and certainly anybody else, we can work with that topic for a bit. And then George wanted to share with people the formula for how to calculate your water, how to transfer, what was it, the gallons per minute into.
Yeah. Most people are going to be working with either a well or a spring, or sometimes you may have a pond or or water tank. But if you're working with a spring, especially, or some source like that, it might be a small flow, and you need to know how much that is. So I'll talk about that later.
So we'll talk about that, and then ideally, if people have any other topic that they really want to make sure that we cover, that would be where we go next. And certainly if topics occur to you or questions occur to you while we're talking about financing and water, go ahead and put them in the chat so that they don't get lost.
Okay, so I'm not real savvy on the Zoom, but help me understand. Basically, I'd like to have a discussion about financing, understand if anybody in the group has sought financing, especially as a beginning farmer and rancher. What's the most practical way to sort of engage with that as a back and forth, as opposed to me having a lecture?
Leah, you have a suggestion?
Sorry, what are you trying to do, Paul?
Well, I should like to have a conversation with the members of the Zoom session instead of lecturing at them, but I don't quite understand the most productive or practical way to do that with the application.
So my suggestion for everyone is, if you don't yet have it on gallery view, to do that so you can see everyone's faces. So that's in the top
On my
right.
phone, that might be my trouble.
Yeah, it is tough on a phone to be able to see other people in the room.
So if you guys see me, I'm not on a dating app.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, if you're on a phone, you might be stuck with just seeing one camera at a time.
Okay.
But I do see lots of people turn their cameras on now, so I think they're perked up and paying attention. And we do have a small enough group tonight that I want to encourage people to feel free to jump in. If we're interrupting each other, we can go back to doing the hand raising. And I see Bill raising his hand there.
Oh yeah. So Paul, since you want to have a little back and forth, I have some good friends that leased a place from an owner in Garfield County, and when they put this thing together, they were taking care of. They had a great partnership with a rancher. They were taking care of their cows, but when they moved to this leasing arrangement with the owner, they couldn't find any traditional financing in their area because they didn't have any collateral. They ended up getting financed from the people who were providing their cattle for the lease on the place they were leasing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, it seems this is a big challenge for young people. Well, I think the custom grazing sure lends itself to a better way of doing this, but certainly, what's your experience of acquiring capital, to get something done?
Yeah, I had the same trouble about lacking collateral. And so a specific example, I was seeking an FSA beginning farmer operating line this year. So they require 100% collateral. Everything that they lend you, you need to have 100% of the value in assets as security for them, in case anybody's not comfortable with collateral. My understanding is that pretty low compared to if you're going to enter into what they call a traditional financing relationship with a private bank, where often the collateral needs will be higher than 100%. And I'm really not savvy with financing. So, you know, if I'm wrong, tell me, but that's my experience. And so I didn't have enough collateral. Now with the FSA loans specific to beginning farmer and ranchers, they do have some flexibility in which they will allow you to use what you have purchased as your collateral for the loan that you use to purchase it. However, I didn't want to do that because I don't want to purchase anything. That's my trouble, right? What the FSA wants you to do is to become a farmer or a rancher. And in their mind, that means that you own something that's an agricultural product. So in my particular case, the loan officer at the FSA wanted me to buy cattle in order to get the loan, so that then they could use the cattle as collateral for the loan, which, I mean, all of us probably are paying attention to cattle markets. What a terrible idea. I shouldn't do that. I came to this loan, this is my opinion. I came to the loan officer with a business plan, which involved me not taking on the risk of buying animals. I didn't have to have any major investments. All I wanted was enough money to build fence, which I believed was a long-term investment, but you can't collateralize fence because I guess the FSA is not interested in picking it up again. So instead of financing me to build a business plan, which I showed them in a cash flow was functional and profitable in its very first year, they wanted me to buy cows with $50,000 that they would then use as collateral, in which I could not have paid off within 5 years, you know, within the whole term of the loan. So even the FSA beginning farmer stuff for me has been a frustration, because custom grazing also is not agricultural production, because I don't own or create an agricultural product or commodity that I then sell, according to the FSA. So I am a service provider. As a custom grazer, you would be a service provider. You're identifying a resource, something that needs that resource, bringing those two together. So that's been my experience. That's the closest I've gotten to traditional financing. I almost feel like I'd have more success at a bank than I would have had at the FSA. And that's people's complaint about working with the FSA, the Farm Service Agency, is that there's a lot of red tape. But on the flip side of that red tape are 2% and 3% interest rates, which is almost free money. So, you know, I in my opinion, if you can spend 3 days of your life doing the headache that is red tape to see if you can get 2% and 3% money from the FSA, that's worth the headache. But a lot of people, it sounds like, avoid working with the FSA or seeking those type of financing through USDA because of red tape.
So if I could just follow up a little bit, and that was great. I mean, it's just sort of funny. I was talking with Dave Pratt, with, ranch management consultants, and, I was talking about a project of young people leasing some cows and on a place that you're aware of. And he says, and how to build equity. And he said, that building up equity, that's old school. Cash flow is where it's at. And so it seems like at a young age, you figured out probably a way to really manage risk and generate cash. And I probably wish I could have learned that 40 years ago. So congratulations. Keep building on your approach.
Well, the thing I don't like about that, though, from an ethical standpoint, is I don't want to have the pure capitalist mindset on managing risk. Like, I don't want to give it all to somebody else and just take money from them. That's exploitative. What I'd like to build is an opportunity to share risk equally, and therefore, have greater access to reward. So I don't know what that model looks like, but in my mind, purely custom grazing and receiving cash payments for the rest of my working life as a person managing grazing lands is not what I want to do. but it's a good way to get started, I feel like, to keep risk as far away from yourself as possible.
Yeah, I think that is, that's an important thing to always be considering, I think. I just wanted to, we've had another couple of questions, and so I thought we could kind of direct into those and then see where we end up. One of the questions was, who should be responsible for maintenance and new infrastructure? And what about working with the Nrcs to put in new infrastructure in place of a leasing situation? So some questions about working with the Nrcs, as well as if there's a major infrastructure thing on a piece of land that you're leasing, how do you figure out who's responsible for that? So George had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm always feel like I'm responsible for the infrastructure, because without it, my grazing infrastructure won't work very well. So if it's new infrastructure, especially, it's, probably not a lot of maintenance in the first place, and you just need to fix it if you tear it up. If it's old infrastructure and it takes a lot of work, that can be a problem. If you're dealing with a place that has a lot of pipelines that are leaking constantly, and what you've leased really isn't capable of doing what you need it to do, then you need to have a conversation with the owner at that point. If it's old infrastructure that's not good enough, and those are things you need to think about beforehand and learn, at least ask the questions in the beginning, and so how you're going to handle that. But and Nrcs, as far as they usually put in inside fences, they won't put up outside fences, and they tend to like to make a really expensive barbed wire fence. I don't know about temporary electric fencing, whether Nrcs will pay for that or not. I haven't ever.
They do.
I don't think they do. They like to build 6-wire barbed wire fences and then leave all the gates open. It's been my experience with those deals.
But I think I'm wondering if part of what's buried in that question is that if you're a custom grazer, if you're someone like Paul, and you don't own the land, but you're selling your services to somebody to manage that land, I would think that most infrastructure increases property values. So the property owner is usually responsible for that because it adds value to their asset. You might be asked to assist in helping to put in infrastructure or something like that. And if that wasn't part of your original agreement, you might want to talk about there being additional payment or getting a deduction on your lease or something in exchange for your labor to do that. So you definitely, if there were infrastructure needs that the landowner had plans for and was sort of assuming you were going to be part of carrying either the financial or the labor burden of that, that would be something you definitely want to talk about before you got too far into your conversation, because it may be certainly from a financial standpoint, it may be unworkable for you to be able to contribute to that. And again, if you have a longer term lease, like we had a lease for 9 years on a property, and so we were willing to do some infrastructure on our own dime, because after the first year, the landowner was very happy and we just knew we were going to have the benefit of that place. So it was worth it to us to put in a permanent high tensile fence to divide some land up so that we could run more temporary fences to subdivide. But that would be something you wouldn't necessarily want to do in a first year if it wasn't necessary. And again, the asset belongs to the landowner. So I think you'd want to try to make sure that the landowner handled that. And my guess is that you, as someone who doesn't own the land, actually couldn't sign some agreement with the Nrcs to put in an infrastructure project on someone else's land. The landowner has to be the person who approves that.
Well, I'll jump in there, Julie. Actually, so I have a lease for my family. So it's kind of a different situation because I'll probably possibly end up owning it someday, hopefully. But I want to go back to what Paul was saying about the way they view custom grazing. And I'll say that I was able to get them to view custom grazing as sharing in the profit or loss by having the cattle on the gain. So in that case, you're going to make more money if they gain more, or lose money if you're a poor grazer. But then also, I can see this as an incentive, and I actually have some equip contracts I'm just completing and all that, but I just kind of wanted to see what you guys had to say. But I think that there's some incentive for landowners to want to lease to a young agrarian within their first 10 years as a beginning farmer or rancher, because you get like a great cost share rate. And in my case, it was 100%. So that might be sort of a negotiating point that you can use to kind of get a lease, and for a longer period, long enough at least to get those projects. And if you have a good equip application, you get funded, that might be some incentive that you guys could work with.
That's a great point, Emily. George and I don't actually use NRCS equip funds, so it's not something we're particularly familiar with. So that's great information.
Oh yeah, the beginning, the number and variety of advantages of beginning farmer and rancher status and working with federal and state agencies is pretty great. I have a lease that's in the TIP program, the Transition Incentive Program, and we have a lot of CRP ground, Conservation Reserve Program ground in our area. Transition Incentive Program is one which will pay the owner of the land coming out of a CRP contract the same rate they've been paid for the CRP contract for 2 additional years after the end of the contract, if they have a agreement. I think it's for at least that long. It might be a little longer, with a person who qualifies as a beginning farmer and rancher. So that's a negotiating tactic, which has given me access to land that I wouldn't necessarily be able to afford otherwise. So the owner of this land, is willing and able to accept a lower per acre lease rate because he's receiving CRP payments, and there's nobody else around me who's going to give him that opportunity. And also, CRP is changing, right? So there's land that's been enrolled in CRP for a long time that they're not going to enroll again. So that's a little harder to identify. There's a little bit of, I think, negotiating savvy you have to figure out there with people that you're working with, because the CRP contract negotiation is between that landowner and the FSA. You're not necessarily privy to that information about whether it will be enrolled again or not. But if you can come with a proposal that says, hey, I'm able to offer you this, and you're not going to get that anywhere else, that's a pretty good negotiating position that the beginning farmer and rancher status can help you achieve. But it doesn't last forever, so you got to take advantage of it. Once you sign up, the clock is ticking.
So is there anything else around financing that anybody had to share or thoughts? Or if not, George can move on to the water.
I'm particularly interested if anyone in this group has engaged in the process of starting a business with some of this slow money financing, private financing. We have some relationships with Velicus Farms that is private financing in sort of a slow money model with low interest rates. And then there's some that I've seen in Montana, particularly the Kiva loan program, which is like a crowdsource private lending for 0 interest loans. So I wonder if anybody has any personal experience with that they'd like to share. I could share some about how that works for us from the farm aspect. I haven't engaged with any of that in my own business.
We haven't done any of it. I do know that Woody Taish has started a sort of a separate program that he calls Soil And it is exactly that. It's sort of a local community-based funding where a community comes together and creates a funding source. And then there's a board, which is usually producers who are part of that community project, who then determine who gets that funding. We do know some farmers who've gotten funding that way, but we haven't actually pursued it ourselves. But I know that it's something that Woody himself is very excited about, hoping that it will take off. And he's written a book about it. So
Okay, well, if there's nobody else working with it, then we'll just have this meeting again next year. And we can all talk about it then.
great.
Uh,
Thanks, Leah, for posting that link in there. So you want to do the water thing?
So I can get into the water thing now. If you, depends on what your water source is, you need to, like I mentioned a while ago, you need to know how much water you need in a day. And so there's a couple of ways of working this. You can work from the number of animals you have to see how many gallons per minute that you're going to need of a basic flow. And so we use a lot of springs up in the mountains that don't flow very much water. And so they might be 1.5 gallons a minute, up to 3 gallons a minute in this country is really a good spring. And so if you take, but the thing about them is they flow 24 hours a day. And so you take that gallon per minute figure and you multiply that times 60 minutes, which gives you gallons per hour. And then you take that times 24 hours, and that gives you a total of gallons per day. And a cow with a calf on her, I like to figure around 20 gallons per head per day. So another way to look at that would be if I had 100 pair, and I needed 20 gallons per pair per day, that's 2,000 gallons that I need to have available to those cows to drink in a very short period of time. I don't want them trying to drink that little tiny flow where one cow at a time has to get their mouth down on a broken pipe and try to get a drink. That's not a working deal. But if I know I need to have 2,000 gallons of at least of storage somewhere, whether the tank is that big, or I have a water truck there, or I have 2 tanks, or I have, sometimes I've had to calculate how many miles of pipeline I have and what the volume is that's stored in that pipeline by the diameter of the pipe and the length and all that. That's fun to figure out while you're sitting up there waiting for water to come through a pipe. But anyway, you have 100 pair, 20 gallons a day, that's 2,000 gallons. And you divide that by 24 hours. That's 83.3 gallons an hour that you need. You divide that by 60 minutes, that's 1.3 gallons per minute. And so the way you figure that out is you take that spring and get it and take a water bottle or anything that you need to know what size it is based on gallons. Or if you're figuring liters, I don't have metric cows, so I don't know how many liters a cow drinks, but I do know about gallons. And so at 1.3 gallons a minute, the way to figure that out is to make sure all of that flow is going in your water bottle and set your stopwatch and see how long it takes it to fill that water bottle. And so you divide that number of seconds that it takes to fill a quart, and that has to equal at least 1.3 gallons per minute for 100 pair. And you have to store that. And we've done quite a bit of that in different ways. If we have a solar well and a pump, then we'll take that pump and isolate it and let it flow under bright sunlight and measure how long it takes to fill a quart or a gallon or whatever container we can find, and then use a stopwatch and calculate that flow. And then we know that we have enough water for the day. With solar wells, they only work 8 to 10 hours a day and then they're off. If you have a generator, The generator may run a pump that'll pump 5 or 10 gallons a minute or 20 gallons a minute, depending on the well and the situation. But it's limited by how big its gas tank is. So you need to know how long the generator will run in a day if you got to leave, and make sure that it'll run long enough to fill up your storage. And so I hope that's clear enough, but you got to get, just like animal days per acre, you have to get down to that basic number that you have to have per animal unit, and then see if your supply matches that in some way.
So are there any other questions or topics or concerns that anybody has at all? If not, we can end early, but we're certainly happy to. And Paul, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to cover.
I just had a quick anecdote about attempting to use a small bank for getting a loan for cows. So, because we were talking about that earlier, I haven't tried to go through FSA, and I really was just trying to see if I could even get a loan for cows. And in my experience, and I was recommended to use a small bank by the extension agent I was speaking with, because for some reason probably the reason stated he didn't think FSA was a good option. And the experience I had was that they had no idea what I was talking about. And the woman that I spoke to said she needed to like forward it to someone more experienced. And a week went by and I got a call. And the lady who called me was like, "This is in response to your loan for a car." And I was like, "Oh, I wasn't asking for a loan for a car. I was asking for a loan for cows." And she was like, "What? What are you talking about?" And all in all, what ended up happening was I have no collateral, and without a cosigner, they weren't able to do anything. So I feel like that could be echoed with a lot of people that try to go through a small bank. If you don't have collateral, you may just have to get like your grandma to sign on to the loan with you if you want to get 20 cows or something. But that could be different elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that challenge of having people in the financing industry who are not savvy enough with agricultural production is a serious one. You know, financing is all about avoiding risk, and so ignorance is a serious risk. My experience also has been a caution. I don't understand financing systems very well. I don't have a lot of money, so maybe that's my problem. But it's really easy to feel pretty dumb when you're talking to somebody in that role, like a loan officer at a bank, or even at the FSA, where their stated mission is to help you as a farmer. There are times where they might ask you a question, or like just the whole context of it makes it feel like your personal choices, your capabilities, your understanding of finance, your ability to make money, therefore be a successful person in society, is under scrutiny, right? Because they want to figure out if you're worth lending money to. That for me is a serious hurdle. That kind of makes me nervous to go in to a place and make a request, you know, that fear of scrutiny. So that's a place for me personally where engaging my mentor, who has a lot of experience working with various financing throughout his life, and asking for assistance from that person just to accompany me in that mission, was a really big help for me. So if you're in a position like myself where you're kind of suffering from the fear of the scrutiny or your own ignorance in terms of seeking financing, having some assistance just from somebody to come to a meeting with you, get their feedback about how that went, or give you some indication of what you need to do to be prepared for having that kind of meeting and to make a strong impression on a loan officer or something, I think can be really valuable.
I just want to piggyback off that for folks on the call who are apprentices, one of our former apprentices is now a farm loan officer and is super eager to talk to apprentices. He's back east. I think he's in North Carolina, but you know, they're big loans and they apply out here. And I've already connected one of the Southwest apprentices with him. And so, as any of you are in that realm and someone who's very sort of attentive to what Paul was saying and where, people are at in the stages you're at in your careers and sort of just trying to figure out what all the language means, he might be a good and sort of kind way to start that conversation.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is one time George and I were going to purchase some animals from a friend. And we actually had another friend who'd had some money in a CD, and he said that he wanted to actually help us invest that in cows. And we gave him an interest rate that was a little bit better than his CD. And he didn't necessarily need the money back right away because he had it invested. And so he actually made a little bit more money off of it. We were able to purchase 27 cattle for our finishing operation and then eventually pay him back. So sometimes you can find someone like that who has made a modest investment and they'd be willing to swap that money over into investing in you.
I have a couple quick practical notes that I wanted to share. This is about investing in equipment. If you have a need for investing in equipment, I highly recommend that you use auctions in particular. Well, one, they're really fun. To bid on stuff is a lot of fun. And two, I've learned from my mentor, Doug, we have a lot of equipment on the farm. Farms have a lot of equipment, and then also organic farms have twice as much. And that's a huge piece of investment we spend on. And Doug has saved well over $1 million in money simply by putting the work in, searching for things that we need and finding them at auctions. You just kind of set yourself up for that rare opportunity where nobody else there bidding that day is going to want that thing that you want. So for me, I got my water truck at auction for a significant discount from its actual market value because nobody else wanted that day. Same thing with a pickup. So, there's basic goals for myself in the business. I want to avoid risk whenever possible. And I want to optimize cash flow, which is part of why I have a custom grazing enterprise. I want to do and acquire things cheaply. So I like to think of myself as a bottom feeder. Anytime that I can get something that is waste to somebody else and turn it into value for my business, that's a huge step for me. I like to make exchanges with people on barter because at this point in my life, my labor is sort of infinitely replicatable, but my cash resource is distressingly finite. So, if I can save some money on materials or something by working with neighbors and negotiating in that way, that's a thing I'm always seeking an opportunity to do. And then another thing I wanted to talk about, it feels strange for me to be giving advice. I don't have a lot of experience. Seems a little disingenuous if I'm being honest, but this is something that I think is valuable that doesn't always occur to everybody, is that working with landowners or that anybody you're leasing from or working with, we talked about some these basic aspects of like good communication are really vital. And for me, it's a big challenge personally being a young person in agriculture because almost everybody you work with, especially landowners, are going to be significantly older than you, twice your age or more. That's just the state of the demographics. It's a really tough balance for me to exhibit the confidence I have in myself, show my reliability and my expertise with people, while at the same time maintaining humility, being open-minded, and having, a realistic assessment of what's possible. If you have a landowner that you're working with who's pretty involved, their expectations about what you're going to do with their land may be really different from your vision. In this past year, I've had to work with a neighbor who the opportunity there has been really valuable for me, but we don't see hardly anything the same way. So I've had to simplify my plan for their land and compromise with them on my vision of the best way to graze the animals on that land, so that I could keep a positive relationship with that neighbor and landowner. Being able to maintain that positive relationship actually ended up yielding me some pretty significant benefits. He gave me some free hay when there was bad weather coming, and he offered to do that of his own accord. And I ascribe that most definitely to the work that I put in to make a positive relationship with this person. And then he went out of his way to, check on water and maintain water for me, and communicated with me directly and early about that. And we've also developed some potential opportunities to put our own resources together for mutual benefit in the future. And again, I ascribe all of that to that work of communication and maintaining a positive relationship, and in particular being able to compromise.
It's a really great point. So anything from anyone else? We're coming into the final 10 minutes, and if we're all zoomed out, we can go away. And if anybody has a last question, topic, those of you who did turn in the exercise, George and I will send you some comments back by email so that you don't feel like you did it for naught. And thank you for doing it. They were good prompts for us in thinking about what to talk about today.
Julie, I would say maybe it might be helpful to talk about drought clauses in a lease.
Yep. We did talk about that a little bit in the first session, about how it's really important to make sure that you have discussed clearly what happens in case of drought, flood, fire, and that there is, and ideally you have that in writing in whatever contract, lease agreement, MOU you have between you and a landowner. And the sample leases the sample lease that we gave people last week in the first session does have such a clause in it. And we have indeed had to, when we have custom grazed other people's animals this year, as a matter of fact, when we saw that we weren't getting rain and we started to think that we were going to have some trouble, we very early on communicated with the livestock owner that we thought we were going to have him take his cattle back. So our clause in our contract, I think, said that we give them 10 days notice. But we actually gave him probably at least a month's warning before we realized that it really was as bad as it was. And it was a difficult and tense conversation, even though it was in writing and we had discussed it. He didn't have another place for his cattle. So that was that was and can be a really challenging situation. But it's really important to, we had one year where our leased property on the Rio Grande River, we had over 300% of snowpack. And so when the snow started to melt, about half of the property was underwater into July. So all of a sudden we had infinitely less acres and the same number of animals. And so we were leasing that land on an animal unit basis, not an acre basis. So that's a good warning about, a bunch of those acres were not usable for months because they were underwater. And then we shouldn't have grazed them because the soils were so saturated, we would pug them. So if we had been paying by the acre, we would have had a significant loss there. Because we were paying by the animal unit month, we could stock appropriately. So if you are in an area where drought or flood are highly likely, again, that per acre basis could be a problem for you. And you might want to include something about changing your agreement should some of those acres be unusable.
And I think it's important nowadays, and with the technology that's available, to use the drought monitor, the National Drought Monitor deal, and you can have
Grasscast and-
have a conversation with your partner here, whether it's the guy with the cattle or the land, that at what point is going to trigger destocking.
Mhm.
And so if you've thought about that ahead of time and you kind of know what your threshold is, then you can start to seriously consider destocking based on a prediction of, you know, of the drought monitor. So those kind of tools are available. There's grass.
There's Grasscast.
Yeah,
and
Grasscast.
the National Drought Action Network has put together, they did a webinar earlier this year for the NAP apprentices, and they have a lot of great tools available on their website, and they can lead you to others. So I think, Emily, that's a great question, because I think all of us, whether we're landowners, livestock owners, or people trying to put together something in the middle, becoming more familiar with those tools so we can make accurate assessments and have really knowledge-based conversations rather than kind of hope-based conversations around things like drought, will probably help us create lease agreements that are based in reality.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think it's really easy to think about what is the optimum situation of forage production and the, you know, all your wells working at once, but what happens when you have an emergency? And if you only have one well and pipeline or something, and
Yeah.
that well goes down, that's another thing that would cause you to have to get your cattle off a place. So I think stay away from having like the optimum projections and go with something super conservative. Maybe even have a couple of models of like, what if I get 50% of the rain of average rain, and then what if I get, you know, 15% above normal, and being able to be flexible and add cattle in years where you get more rain and you don't necessarily need to hold back to restore areas. So kind of being flexible in that lease.
Mhm. And again, I think that speaks to something that if it can be difficult to move into an area you don't know and try to learn what you need to learn about weather patterns, how frequently drought happens, how severely it happens, how frequent is drought, you know, and then just having the time to build the relationships with the people you want to have partnerships with. And so I know, like Paul said earlier, sometimes it makes sense to move someplace where opportunity seems to be available and start to build those relationships and build your knowledge of the land base and the weather patterns so that you can do the things that Emily is saying. It's very hard as a newcomer to gather enough information sometimes to feel like you can make an accurate assessment and have strategies for the complications that could arise. And that's another place where agencies like the Nrcs and Extension can really help you if you're new to an area. They can help give you a lot of good information to help you make the kind of assessments that Emily's talking about.
You know, I'm kind of running into that. I try to do, you know, flat rate per acre over a multi-year lease, but those rates are all based on the past. And it seems like, you know, the past is not prologue as far as drought conditions. And so I'm struggling a bit with just trying to guess what that good rate per acre is, given the, you know, wild fluctuations in forage production on land from year to year. And just trying to figure out the best way to try to peg those rates. You know, that's just, it seems really tricky, but it feels like heading into probably a decline in forage production overall if you average it out over 10 years or something, maybe.
Yeah. You know, I didn't have a chance to put it together before this call, but I got a lot of good resources around those kinds of things from our NRCS range ecologist here. And I'll specifically ask her also about anyone she's knowing who's trying to do some sort of predictions as that's related to pasture lease rates. And if I can find some additional resources, we'll definitely put some resources together and send them out to people in a couple of days. And I'll see if I can find anything about anyone who's doing that kind of work, Tony.
That would, thank you. Great.
Anything else? I see that Leah put in the chat the link to the Drought Learning Network call. Anything
threw-
else, anyone? Oh, go ahead.
I threw my email in there too, so if anybody wants to contact me, please go ahead if you haven't heard enough from me. I specifically also, this wasn't really related to this topic, but I had a lot of learning this year around grazing as it relates to annual cropping systems. That was pretty new for me and could be relevant to some other Montana producers in particular, maybe a larger geography, but that's not really relevant to this call. But if anybody would like to talk about that or swap stories through email, that would be all right with me. And thanks for having me, everybody.
So are we done, everyone? Or, oh, looks like George had something to say.
I'm just going to
Oh,
thank Paul
okay.
and Leah, and help us put this together. And it's always nice to see all your faces. And feel free to email us if you have particular questions. We're a resource, and I like to spend a little time with people if they're having a particular problem, sometimes to just help them get, find a solution if we can. So reach out.
Well, thank you so much, George and Julie and Paul. Yeah, really appreciate your willingness to share all of this great information. And yeah, I know that they're all really genuine when they're offering, themselves as resources to follow up with. So don't be shy.
Okay, everyone, get up and walk around and get circulation back in your legs.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.